Before we dive into today's story of betrayal and redemption, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because every week, we uncover real stories of heartbreak, revenge, and justice that will leave you speechless. Now, let me tell you how one man's greed nearly cost me everything, until I turned the tables. I never thought the man I once called my husband would one day become my greatest enemy. When I first met Richard, I believed he was everything I'd ever wanted: charming, confident, and endlessly ambitious. He had this way of looking at me, as if I was the missing piece in his perfect life. I didn't know back then that I'd one day be the only thing standing between him and the life he thought he deserved. My name is Amelia Hartman, and this is the story of how my husband tried to steal everything from me: my home, my peace, my dignity, and how I took it all back, piece by piece. It started with silence, the kind of silence that creeps into a marriage slowly, like fog rolling in over calm water. One day you're laughing over dinner, and the next, you're sitting across from a stranger who won't even meet your eyes. Richard had always been ambitious, but lately, that ambition had turned into something darker. He talked less about our future and more about his opportunities. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe he was just stressed from work. But soon I realized it wasn't work that was changing him. It was greed. Our penthouse was my pride and joy. Every corner of that place carried a memory. Our first anniversary dinner, the night we adopted our golden retriever, Milo, the morning sunlight hitting the marble floors just right. I'd spent years building a home filled with warmth and love, only for him to turn it into a prize to be taken. I still remember the first time I caught him lying. It wasn't about something big, just a small detail, a work trip that didn't line up with his calendar. But something about his tone, the way his eyes darted away, made my stomach twist. That's when I started watching, listening, paying attention, and what I found was worse than I ever could have imagined. He wasn't just hiding something, he was planning something. Late-night calls to his lawyer, hidden documents in his briefcase, quiet messages from an unknown contact saved under a man's name. My instincts screamed that something wasn't right. I wasn't ready to accept it, not yet. So I told myself I was overthinking, that maybe marriage was just hard. But that night, when I opened his laptop after he fell asleep, my entire world shattered. There it was. A draft of a legal agreement. My name, Amelia Hartman, listed as a dependent spouse. My penthouse, my company shares, even the jewelry collection my late mother left me, all marked for transfer. And at the top of that document, in bold black letters, was the title, Preliminary Divorce Settlement, Hartman versus Hartman. I felt my heart stop. He wasn't planning a future with me. He was planning to take it all. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, frozen. Then the realization hit. This wasn't just betrayal. It was war. I remember whispering to myself, "You won't win, Richard. Not this time." And that was the moment everything changed. From that night forward, I stopped being the naive wife he thought he could manipulate. I became something else, someone colder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. Because when a man tries to take your whole life away, you don't just fight back. You rewrite the story. If you had met us 5 years ago, you'd think we were the perfect couple. People used to say, Amelia and Richard, they have it all. And maybe, at one point, we did. Richard was magnetic. He could walk into any room and command attention without even trying. He had that natural charm, the kind that made people believe in him instantly. And me, I was the calm to his storm. I balanced him out, reminded him to breathe, to stay grounded. We met in San Francisco at a charity gala I helped organize. He was standing by the bar, wearing that confident smile he'd later weaponized so easily. He told me he was in real estate. Building dreams, he said, which now feels like the cruelest irony. I was an interior designer back then. I loved creating beauty, turning empty rooms into spaces that felt alive. Richard admired that about me, or at least he pretended to. He said I had an eye for value, that I could see potential in things before anyone else could. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. Because Richard wasn't complimenting me, he was studying me. The first few years were bliss. We moved fast, maybe too fast. Within a year, we were married and moved into a modest apartment downtown. We built everything together, or so I thought. I worked long hours taking client calls while Richard climbed his way up the business ladder. Every milestone we reached felt like a joint victory. I still remember the night he brought me to see the penthouse for the first time. It was unfinished, just cold concrete, dust, and exposed beams. But standing there, overlooking the skyline, I saw the future. "One day," he said, "this will be ours." And it was. I poured my soul into that place. Every detail, the oak flooring, the soft neutral palette, the art that lined the walls, it was all a reflection of the life I thought we were building together. I'd host dinners, fill the rooms with laughter, and think, this is happiness. This is what love looks like. But love, as I learned, can be the most deceptive illusion of all. It started small. The missed dinners, the late meetings, the faint scent of a perfume that wasn't mine. I noticed it once, brushed it off, then twice, and that time my heart caught fire. Still, I kept giving him the benefit of the doubt. That's what loyalty does to you. It blinds you, convinces you that you can fix what's already broken. Richard had changed. His smiles no longer reached his eyes. He'd talk about money the way poets talk about love, passionately, endlessly. The man who once asked how my day was, now only asked about stock prices, commissions, and investments. Sometimes late at night, I'd watch him sleep and wonder where the man I married had gone. How do you lose someone who's lying right beside you? One morning, I walked into the kitchen and saw him on the phone. His tone was hushed, his words clipped. When he saw me, he smiled too quickly. "Just business," he said. Slipping his phone into his pocket, something in his voice made my chest tighten. It wasn't just business. He had started spending more time networking, flying out for property deals. But when I checked his calendar one day, the cities didn't match the locations on his expense reports. I wanted to confront him, but part of me was scared. Scared that if I asked the wrong question, I'd hear the truth I wasn't ready to face. Because here's what no one tells you about betrayal. It doesn't happen in an instant. It happens in moments, subtle, quiet, almost invisible. It creeps in like a whisper. You start to feel it before you can name it. One night after he came home late again, I asked him, "Do you still love me?" He looked at me, expressionless. "Amelia, why would you even ask that?" "I don't know," I said softly. "You just feel far away lately." He sighed, walked past me, and muttered, "You're imagining things." But I wasn't imagining anything. The distance between us was real, growing, and it had a purpose I couldn't yet see. To the outside world, we were still perfect. We still showed up to charity events hand in hand, smiled for photographs, and played our parts flawlessly. But at home, silence filled the space where laughter used to live. One rainy evening, I found myself sitting alone in the penthouse living room, watching city lights blur through the window. I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made, the projects I turned down, the friends I lost touch with, the dreams I postponed, all to build our life. And for what? For a man who now treated me like a stranger in my own home. Milo, our golden retriever, rested his head on my lap, sensing the sadness I tried to hide. I whispered to him, "It's okay, boy. Everything's fine." But even as the words left my mouth, I didn't believe them. A few weeks later, I noticed something strange. A courier dropped off an envelope addressed to Richard, marked confidential. Normally, I'd leave his mail alone, but something about it felt off. It was from a private legal firm. I didn't open it that day. I just stared at it, sitting on the marble counter like a warning sign. My gut told me this envelope wasn't just about business. It was about us, and that was the first night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, replaying every moment, every lie, every time he said, "Trust me." Little did I know, that envelope was only the beginning. A small crack that would soon shatter everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and the man I loved, because the life I thought I had wasn't mine at all. That envelope haunted me for days. It sat on the kitchen counter, mocking me every time I passed by. Richard didn't even notice it. He just tossed his keys beside it each night like it didn't exist. But I noticed. And one evening, after he left for another business dinner, I finally gave in. My hands trembled as I slid a knife under the seal. Inside were several neatly folded pages stamped with the name of a law firm I'd never heard of. I unfolded them slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could barely read. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then the words started to blur together. joint assets, spousal dependency, property reassignment. And then my name, Amelia Hartman, listed under transfer of ownership, the penthouse. My design company shares, my inheritance, all under his name. I read it again, thinking I'd misunderstood. But no, it was crystal clear. Richard had been quietly moving everything into his control, preparing for a divorce he hadn't even told me about. My knees went weak. I grabbed the edge of the counter, staring at those papers as the truth sank in. The man I had loved for years wasn't planning our future. He was planning my downfall. I sat there for hours, unable to move. The city outside buzzed with life, but inside, everything felt still. Dead. By the time Richard came home that night, I had put the papers back exactly where I found them. He walked in with that same confident smile, kissed my cheek, and said, "You're quiet tonight." Quiet. If only he knew what was happening inside my head. That night, while he slept, I sat in the corner of our bedroom, just watching him. I searched his face for any trace of the man I married, the one who used to bring me coffee in bed, who laughed at my bad jokes, who promised to protect me. But all I saw was a stranger. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I'd ignored before. A phone call that ended the second I entered the room. Mysterious receipts tucked inside his jacket. Credit card charges for dinners at restaurants we'd never been to together. Then came the perfume again. Stronger this time. Floral. Expensive. I felt sick. I followed him one evening. He said he had a late client meeting at the Westin. I parked across the street and waited. An hour passed before I saw him, walking out of the hotel with someone. She was tall, elegant, maybe a few years younger than me. She laughed as he held the door open for her, his hand resting gently on her back like he used to do with me. I froze. My world just collapsed. I watched them walk to his car, still laughing, still pretending to be the perfect couple. The man I loved, the man I defended, was living a double life. I didn't cry that night. I thought I would, but the tears never came. I just drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. When Richard came back hours later, smelling like her perfume, I smiled at him. And that scared him. He didn't know it, but that smile meant I was done being the victim. The next morning I made him breakfast, just like always. He acted normal too. We sat there pretending everything was fine. But behind every word, every glance, there was war. I spent the following weeks quietly gathering evidence. Bank statements, emails, even photos. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with it all, but I knew I needed the truth and proof. Then one afternoon, while Richard was out, I received a call. It was from my accountant, Daniel. "Amelia," he said hesitantly. "I need to ask, did you authorize a transfer of $600,000 to an account in the Cayman Islands?" My heart dropped. "What?" "No, of course not," he sighed. "Then you should probably come in." That meeting changed everything. I learned that Richard had been slowly draining our joint savings for months. Every business trip, every investment deal, was just another layer of his scheme. I felt numb walking out of that office. The city looked the same, people rushing, cars honking, but nothing felt real anymore. That night, I confronted him. I waited until dinner, then placed the legal documents on the table. He looked at them, expressionless. "What's this?" he asked casually. "You tell me," I said, my voice steady. He leaned back, smirking. "You went through my things." "You were going through my life," I shot back. He didn't deny it. That was the part that broke me the most. He just shrugged and said, "You always said everything we have is ours, Amelia. I'm just making sure it stays that way." I laughed bitterly. "Ours? You mean yours? You wanted to take everything from me." He sighed like I was being dramatic. "You'll land on your feet." "You always do." I stared at him, barely recognizing the man sitting across from me. "You were never going to tell me, were you?" He met my eyes and said, "You would have made it harder." That word burned into my mind. He stood up, kissed my forehead, and said, "Don't take this personally, Amelia. It's just business." Then he walked away. Just business. That was the moment I broke, not in tears, but in silence. Because I knew the woman I used to be was gone. I went to the balcony, staring out at the skyline we once dreamed about together. The city lights blurred through my tears as one thought echoed in my mind. He thinks he's already won, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. That night, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't just survive this. I'd take everything back, and when I did, he'd never see it coming. I told myself I wouldn't lower myself to spite or anger. But there's a kind of calm that comes the moment you decide you're not a victim anymore. It isn't loud. It's a quiet, steady heat that sharpens your mind and makes you ruthless in the most civilized way. That's what happened to me. The first week after I discovered everything, I didn't act. I studied. I watched his habits like I'd learned them the day we met, only now my purpose had changed. Where once I looked for sweetness in his smile, I now looked for cracks. Where once I forgave, I now cataloged. I became a student of Richard Hartman's life. You'd be surprised how many mistakes people make when they think they're clever. Greed is sloppy, confidence becomes arrogance, and arrogance leaves tracks. Step 1, contain the damage. I called my lawyer, not the kind that threatened courtrooms, but a quiet, intelligent woman named Elena who specialized in family law and asset protection. I told her everything, but not all at once. I wanted to see how she listened, how she'd react. She asked for documents, dates, and a calm retelling of events. When she spoke about options, temporary restraining of asset transfers, freezing accounts, emergency affidavits. It was technical and cold, but it felt like armor. Next, I put invisible locks on my world. Passwords changed, safe deposit boxes checked, digital footprints traced. I made sure the email address he used to transfer funds no longer had access to my accounts. I set up alerts for any movement in our joint portfolios. I converted what cash I could into places only I controlled. You'd think it would be easier to panic and call him out, but I learned early on that anger is noisy and ruins plans. I was deliberate, methodical. Then I started collecting tangible proof. Evidence is persuasive in courtrooms and devastating in private. I didn't need to expose him with a shout. I just needed to assemble the truth in a way that would stand up to scrutiny. Bank statements, receipts, hotel bookings, text messages, a photo here, a scanned document there. I made copies, digital and paper, and hid them in places only I knew. While I was building the case, I was also building the story I would use against him. People like Richard care about reputation. They live in a world of appearances, charity galas, boardroom smiles, carefully curated social feeds. If you can fracture the image, you fracture the man. That's where subtlety came in. I started with his network. Not with drama, but with questions. Casual conversations at dinner parties, a seemingly innocent coffee with his business partner, a congratulatory text to an old colleague. I watched how they answered, what words shifted when his name came up. The goal wasn't to gossip. It was to map his weaknesses, the clients who relied on him, the investors who trusted his signature, the projects that would crumble without his leadership. There was one file that became my North Star, a misfiled contract I found buried on his shared drive. It wasn't related to us directly, but it contained clauses that suggested his so-called investments were built on unstable promises. If those deals collapsed, so would his cash flow. I started quietly contacting people connected to those projects, not to accuse, but to ask about timelines, permits, approvals. People talk when they think no one's listening. I let them. I also used the one thing he underestimated, my empathy. I reached out to the woman he'd been seeing, not in anger, but with an olive branch. I didn't call her a homewrecker or scream until I was hoarse. I told her the truth, not to shame her, but to ask if she knew the full picture. Somewhere between hurt and disbelief, she confessed things I'd suspected and more I hadn't imagined. She believed him. She thought he loved her. She didn't know about the transfers, the hidden accounts, the legal drafts. Her shock became a weapon of a different kind, an ally who could testify to his deceptions, because she would remember the dates, the trips, the promises he'd made. As I gathered allies, I kept my face serene in public. The penthouse stayed immaculate. Milo still wagged his tail. I played the part of the woman who had it together, because the less he suspected, the faster my plan could move. Richard kept underestimating me, and that arrogance blinded him. He assumed that because I didn't lash out publicly, I didn't understand. He was wrong. There was a moment, a turning point, when I moved from defense to offense. I secured a temporary injunction that would prevent major transfers until our financial arrangements could be reviewed. It was a small legal blow, but the sound of it slicing through his plans was sweeter than I expected. He called that night, his voice sharp with disbelief. "What is this?" he demanded. "Protection," I answered. "For both of us, until things are clear." It wasn't only the law that I used. I used leverage. Every person who would profit from his downfall or be embarrassed by his exposure, I quietly reminded of the consequences of continuing to back him. The board member who had lent him credibility? I had a private meeting with him and laid out the facts without sensationalism. Numbers, dates, undeniable evidence. He pulled his support. One by one, the props holding Richard's public life up began to wobble. I also targeted his pride. There's an ugly satisfaction in watching a man who thinks he can manipulate everything realize that the world can flip on a dime. I fed the right whispers to the right people. Not lies, never lies. Just carefully curated truths that would prompt questioning and audits. Audits dig into foundations. Foundations reveal rot. And while all of this was happening behind closed doors, I prepared for the personal blow. I began planning how to reclaim the life he'd tried to steal. That meant reaching out to old clients of my design firm, quietly reviving contracts I'd paused, and setting up meetings with potential investors who trusted my work. If he took my money, he wouldn't take my future. I rebuilt income streams under new names, refusing to let him use finances as the only measure of my worth. There's an art to revenge that most people don't talk about. It's not satisfying to tear someone down for the sake of cruelty. The most effective revenge is restorative. It's about repairing what was broken and ensuring the person who broke it cannot profit from their deceit. That was my goal, not humiliation for humiliation's sake, but restoration and justice. I remember the night I finally saw his empire start to falter. Reports came in, silent at first. A withdrawn investor, a delayed permit, a suspicious audit flagged by an independent regulator. The pieces I had nudged now had momentum of their own. The arrogance that had kept him afloat began to sink him, but I was careful. I never acted in ways that would label me as vindictive. I remained the calm, composed wife who was now, quietly and efficiently, reclaiming everything. Every court filing was precise. Every public statement was measured. The moral high ground isn't just ethical, it's strategic. People side with the measured woman, not the one who screams. Through it all, Milo stayed my constant. He would curl beside me on the couch while I reviewed documents at midnight. His steady breathing reminded me that life goes on after pain. And for the first time since that initial discovery, I slept without the cyclone of fear in my chest. Because I truly knew, that I was turning the tide. There was a small satisfaction, too, in watching the man who once rehearsed apologies, now scrambled to explain himself. He stopped being the puppet master and became the subject of investigation. His friends looked at him differently. His business calls went unanswered. Where he once commanded rooms, people now assumed he had something to hide. The plan wasn't about revenge in the vengeful sense. It was a blueprint for reclaiming dignity, money, and peace. And as the days passed and the legal wheels turned, one fact became clearer than ever. The truth, when curated and presented with quiet certainty, is a weapon more precise than any outburst. I had one final move left, the part that would cause the most damage without a single raised voice. But I'll save that for the next part, because that's where the real unraveling happens. It's where reputation meets consequence. And I finally make sure he understands what it feels like to lose everything he built on lies. If you think revenge is loud and messy, wait until you see how quietly the mighty can fall. There's a strange hush right before everything breaks, a held breath, like the whole world is waiting to see which way the wind will blow. For weeks, I'd been the quiet architect of change. For weeks, I'd nudged dominoes into place. Now, finally, the moment came when those dominoes would fall. The first sign was procedural, a call from Elena that made my heart hammer in a way it hadn't since the night I found the legal drafts. "They've opened an audit," she said, careful and steady. "An external one. The board has asked for immediate reviews of certain contracts. They want witnesses." Her voice was the calm at the center of the storm. My stomach dropped and rose at the same time. This was what we had worked for. This was also what I'd feared. An audit meant exposure. Exposure meant public scrutiny. Exposure meant people would learn the truth about Richard, but also about us, about our marriage, and about how carefully he'd hidden his moves. The first hearing was formal and cold. The conference room smelled of coffee and expensive suits. Sunlight glinted off the long table and did nothing to warm the atmosphere. I sat at one end, Milo at my feet, and watched as the people who used to nod at Richard's jokes now flipped through pages with unblinking concentration. He sat across the room, composed as ever, yet I could see the tremor in his jaw when the first lawyer began to speak. They read numbers like gospel: transfers, shell companies, offshore accounts. Each figure was a dagger. I felt them pierce the image he had spent years polishing. His trusted partner, Thomas, who used to clap him on the back at launch events, sat stone-faced and avoided eye contact. The board chair, a man who used to call Richard visionary, asked pointed, clinical questions that cut through the charm. You could hear the shifting of alliances in the room like thunder in the distance. When the auditors projected the timeline of transfers, I saw his face lose color. He tried to look at me once, as if to find refuge in the woman he used to pretend to love. But the look that met him wasn't pity. It was the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally been proven right. He realized then that the woman he'd underestimated had outplayed him, and then, the proof that would unravel him. A ledger, simple and undeniable, connecting him directly to the transfers and to falsified invoices. The auditor explained it slowly, measured so there was no room for theatrics, just cold, unassailable facts. The room buzzed. Phones began to whisper. Eyes darted. The empire he'd built on charm and forged documents started to show cracks wide enough to fall through. Richard stood up abruptly. His voice, when he spoke, was a practiced blend of indignation and outrage. These are misinterpretations, he said. We can explain this was for liquidity. Temporary measures. His hands were steady, but his voice had a brittle edge. Elena leaned forward and, with a calm that felt like a match struck, said, temporary measures that were never disclosed to stakeholders or to your spouse. These documents show intent. There was no accusation in it that couldn't be supported. She spoke as if reading from a map that I had helped draw, and every word landed precisely. Witness testimony followed. The woman he'd been seeing, Anna, was there, uncomfortable but truthful. She described trips, dates, and promises he made about investments that were not his alone to promise. Her testimony didn't sound like revenge. It sounded like someone who had been kept in the dark. And when she mentioned a meeting where Richard had laughed about making a clean break, a low murmur traveled across the room like a breeze through dry leaves. The press was waiting outside. You don't realize the power of a headline until you see a photographer's lens trained on someone you used to kiss goodnight. But I didn't flinch. I had chosen my path. If the world wanted to judge, let it. Truth needs air. The board's legal counsel then presented dated emails that tied Richard to a partner who'd benefited from the diverted funds. It was a spiderweb of evidence: receipts, travel itineraries, hotel bills, tiny threads that, when woven together, formed a picture so clear it couldn't be denied. His partner shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The room's earlier deference melted into something like distance. People who had stood beside him now measured their steps. I remember his eyes meeting mine then, and for the first time in months I saw fear there, pure and naked. He always believed fear could be hidden by posture, by indifference. He was wrong. Fear has a way of making you small. You think this will destroy me? He whispered later, when we were alone for a moment in the corridor. His voice was low, theatrical, trying for defiance. You think winning a few legal filings will bring me down? I looked at him, tired and resolute. I don't want to destroy you, Richard. I want what's mine. I want honesty. I want the truth on the table. The words felt plain and final. The next blow came publicly and was swift. A former investor, embarrassed and defensive, issued a statement withdrawing support. The stock prices, the ones he loved to talk about with headlines, wavered. An important project stalled because regulators asked uncomfortable questions. The company's PR machine, once polished and loud, now sputtered and whispered. It's a strange thing to watch a world you built begin to self-destruct. I didn't feel triumphant in a cartoonish way. Instead, there was a solemnity to it, like watching a house burn where you used to live. Houses can be rebuilt. People can be redeemed, but what I felt most was the relief of seeing truth measured and acknowledged. The climax peaked on the day of the emergency board meeting. The room was packed: lawyers, investors, family members, press. He stood in front of them and tried to plead innocence, to point at market forces and bad timing. But the evidence had weight. It was more persuasive than his crafted sentences. One by one, those who had once defended him turned toward quiet action. Votes were taken. Decisions made. When the board voted to suspend him temporarily and to appoint an independent review committee, the look on his face was something I will not forget. For years, he had walked through rooms with his head high, assuming power was his armor. Now that armor had been removed and he stood exposed. I had thought about how I would feel in that moment, vindicated, finally seen, perhaps even bitterly satisfied. What I felt instead was strange and soft, a hollow calm. The fight had required me to change in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had grown sharper, yes, but also steadier. I'd learned the language of law and leverage, but I'd also learned the cost of secrets. After the vote, people approached me, some with congratulations, others with probing questions. Friends I once thought might stand by him called to check on me. My name was in headlines that night, but so were the questions. What had driven me to expose him? How would I recover? Would there be a public spectacle? There was one last confrontation that evening, quiet and electric. He came to the penthouse, as if the place itself was a stage where he could reclaim dignity. He walked through like a man who had thought himself immune. "Amelia," he said, voice soft. "This isn't how I wanted things to be." "No," I said. "It isn't." I could have screamed all the things he had done, hurled the evidence at him, or called the press. But there was a reason I hadn't been loud: dignity. I wanted to keep mine. He looked at me and finally, for the first time, truly saw me. Not the woman who designed rooms or smiled at galas, but the woman who had spent nights awake, piecing together the truth. His gaze searched mine for the woman he once knew, and for a flicker of a second, remorse passed over his face, real, human regret. "Did you ever love me?" he asked, voice raw. The question was small in the scale of everything else. I could have lied, but I said the only honest thing that mattered. I loved the part of you I thought I knew. He sank into a chair as if the act of sitting would steady him. The man who had once commanded rooms now looked smaller, ordinary. And in that humbling, I felt the finality of what I had done, not to destroy him as a person, but to dismantle a life built on deception. Outside, the city lights kept shining as if nothing had changed. Inside, Milo leaned against my leg, head heavy and trusting. It struck me then that life goes on. People fall and rise. Consequences have shape, but they do not define the whole of anyone's existence. As the night settled, I knew the battle wasn't entirely over. Legal fights would continue. Reputations take time to heal or to crumble further. But the turning point had come. The man who tried to take my penthouse, who tried to take my life, had been stopped. Not by spectacle, but by method. Not by cruelty, but by truth. And in that cold, clear morning that followed the storm, I finally felt the first steady heartbeat of a life that could belong to me again. Morning sunlight poured into the penthouse like a soft apology from the universe. For weeks, the rooms had felt like a battlefield, a place where strategy replaced sleep and every shadow carried a secret. Now it felt different, still, open, mine. The board's decision had triggered a wave of consequences. Richard was suspended, his accounts frozen pending investigation. The company's PR team spun stories about temporary restructuring, but everyone knew the truth. In just a few weeks, the man who had once been untouchable had become a case study in hubris and betrayal. I didn't feel like celebrating. I didn't pour champagne or throw a party. Instead, I stood barefoot on the cool marble floor, Milo beside me, and breathed. Deep, slow breaths. It wasn't victory that filled me. It was relief. The constant vigilance, the late-night whispers with Elena, the ache of knowing what was coming, all of it had ended. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to his moves. I wasn't protecting myself from a man I used to love. I was simply living. I started small. I rearranged the living room furniture. I opened curtains that had stayed shut for months. I cooked breakfast for myself, nothing fancy, just scrambled eggs and coffee, and ate it by the window. Milo sat at my feet like he always had, but even he seemed lighter, as if sensing the shift in my energy. Calls came in. Reporters, curious friends, people who wanted a statement. I didn't answer most of them. I let Elena handle what she could. "You don't have to fight anymore," she told me on the phone. "You've already won." But winning wasn't the point anymore. It was reclaiming, rebuilding. I walked through the penthouse and for the first time didn't feel like an imposter. This was my home. This was my life. Not because of the marble countertops or the view, but because I had taken it back on my own terms. There were still legal threads to untangle: divorce filings, settlements, property disputes. But my lawyer had been clear. With the evidence we had, Richard's leverage was gone. He couldn't take the penthouse. He couldn't drain my accounts. He couldn't rewrite the story anymore. The documents, the testimony, the audit, they had all closed the door he'd tried to sneak through. I met with Anna, the woman he had been seeing, one quiet afternoon at a small cafe. She looked tired, but also free. "I didn't know," she said softly, eyes down on her coffee cup. "He told me he was divorced, that it was all mutual." "I believe you," I said. And I did. Looking at her, I didn't feel hate. I didn't feel rivalry. I saw someone else who had been deceived, someone who had been used as a pawn in his endless game. We sat for a long time, just two women untangling a man's lies from their lives. When we parted, it was without bitterness. I began visiting my parents more often. I reconnected with friends I had drifted from. I started sketching again, something I'd given up when my life had been swallowed by Richard's schedule. My hands shook the first time I picked up a pencil, not from fear, but from excitement. It felt like touching a part of myself I had buried. The city outside kept moving, traffic, meetings, headlines, but I moved at my own pace now. No more scrambling to match his tempo, no more sacrificing my instincts for his ambition. Every day, I felt pieces of myself returning, like fragments of light filtering back into a dark room. One afternoon, as I was sorting through old boxes, I found a photograph of us from the early days. We were smiling, laughing, looking like a perfect couple. For a moment, a pang of sadness went through me. Not for him, but for the woman I used to be, the one who believed everything she was told. I held the photo for a long time, then set it down. The past had shaped me, but it didn't define me. I was no longer that woman. I was stronger now, sharper, free. Elena called again that evening. "Settlement hearing is next week," she said. "You're going to walk away from this with everything you're entitled to, and more importantly, with your name cleared." "I don't care about the money," I said. "I just want peace." She was quiet for a moment. "You've earned it, Amelia." That night, I stood by the window, the city glittering below, and thought about the long arc of what had happened. Richard had tried to take my penthouse, my money, my sense of safety. He had underestimated me. But in trying to strip me of everything, he had forced me to find my own strength. I whispered to myself, I took my whole life back. And it was true. Not just the property, not just the legal victories, but my voice, my autonomy, my future. The penthouse wasn't a trophy anymore. It was a reminder, a place where I had been betrayed and where I had chosen to rise. Milo lay at my feet, tail wagging softly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled. A real smile. I had survived. I had rebuilt. And though there were still steps to take, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I was never going back to the woman who let someone else define her worth. This was my life. And it was mine again. They say revenge is about getting even, but I've learned it's really about getting free. When the dust finally settled, when the lawyers stopped calling and the headlines faded, there was a silence I hadn't heard in years, the kind that isn't empty but peaceful. It was in that quiet that I finally understood what all of this had been about. It wasn't about a penthouse. It wasn't even about Richard. It was about me. For so long, I had built my world around someone else's dreams. I'd believed that love meant sacrifice, that trust meant silence, that loyalty meant losing yourself piece by piece. I thought stability came from standing beside him. I was wrong. Stability comes from standing for yourself. When Richard betrayed me, he didn't just take money or property. He took the illusion I had built my life on. And in breaking it, he unknowingly gave me something far more valuable: clarity. I learned that people can look you in the eyes and promise forever, while quietly building exits behind your back. I learned that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "Not this time." And I learned that walking away doesn't make you weak. It makes you wise. The world didn't collapse when I stopped protecting his reputation. The sky didn't fall when I chose truth over appearances. What did happen was quieter. I started to breathe again. I used to wonder if I'd ever forgive him. But forgiveness isn't about letting someone back in. It's about letting yourself move on. I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone listening to my story, it's this. Never let anyone make you feel small in your own life. Never confuse love with control. And never, ever let someone convince you that you're replaceable. People can take things from you, money, homes, promises, but they can't take your resilience. They can't touch your ability to rise again. Today, when I look around my home, I don't see walls that once echoed with lies. I see proof that I survived them. I see a woman who faced betrayal and didn't just endure it, she evolved because of it. My story began with loss, but it ends with freedom. And sometimes, that's the best revenge there is. He tried to take my penthouse, but in the end, I took something he could never touch. My peace, my power, and the woman I became through the fire. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is rebuilding a life they can never be part of again.